Conclusion of the Matter podcast. This is one of your hosts, Ryan Weaver, and here with me is Ren Ferguson. Robbie Santiago is not here today. Little bug going around, just trying to, I guess you could say.
Yeah,
just,
he's not ill, but his wife is ill, so we told him to hit the bricks because we don't want to get it.
well, Ren did. I was no part. Anyway, but welcome back, and thanks for tuning in, viewing in, listening in, whatever media you're using. As Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 13 and 14, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. So I'm going to, just go ahead and kick her over to Ren and let us get started today.
Yep.
So,
Well, again, glad that everybody has tuned in. If you have comments, questions, topic suggestions, or anything like that, just make a comment or email us or message us on Facebook, whatever, and we'd be happy to do that. A lot of our episodes we try to take from listener requests. It helps us to know the things that you guys are studying, the things that you have questions about, so that we can discuss them here. And hopefully, if not being able to answer your question, at least giving you some more information to chew on and to think about as you continue to study whatever topic it may be. And today is one of those such topics. It's one that was requested by one of our listeners, and it has to do with women's roles within the public assembly, and specifically women preaching. There's a number of passages that were given to us to look at, and we'll try to hit on those as we go throughout this particular episode to be able to address maybe some of the arguments that are often brought up in favor of a more egalitarian role for women instead of a complementarian role, which is what we subscribe to, I guess you could say, because it's what the scriptures teach, and we'll try to flesh that out and make that a little bit more clear as we go. I guess to start, I wanted to hit on the fact that women are to be teachers. There's something I've heard before, because there's always a question of, well, or should women evangelize? Should women be teaching people the gospel? And I've heard the statement made before, well, if they aren't, then half of the church isn't doing its job. And so women ought certainly to be teachers. And that Great Commission in Matthew 28, 18 through 20, it applies to everybody that is a Christian, both male and female. I'm sure we'll talk about this more as we go through. The context in which we do that may differ depending on the circumstances or the situation. But I don't think it's wrong for a woman to teach. And I don't even think, depending on the context, I don't even think it would be wrong for a woman to teach a man, depending on the context.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
The one that I typically turn to is, and we've mentioned it before, and because people say, well, they're supposed to be quiet in the assembly. Well, we're instructed to sing, and again, that is also used for teaching. So in essence, they can teach via singing, just like we're. So in that context, I think they're teaching. Yeah. But I think what you were talking about is probably a little more along the lines of, could be a wife teaching a husband. It could be, and there's no one. I say no one, quote unquote. Don't want to get to that. What'd we call it? What was that one episode we did? The Lost. The kind of like.
There's no one around to baptize you.
Why can I not think of what
thing?
we call those islands? What do you call that when?
You call the islands?
Yeah, you get lost on a
desert island.
A deserted. That's. Sorry, guys, it's Monday. Yeah, like a deserted island. There's no one else there but you two. But I think there's other scenarios where women could teach. And I think, you see that in Acts chapter 18 with Aquila and Priscilla.
That's the example I was thinking of.
Okay, and it's like, sure, she and her husband were both involved, but it clearly points out that she was involved.
It says they showed
she
him
was
the way of the
involved
Lord.
in making points. So agreed.
Yeah. But there is a difference, I think, in those more private settings as opposed to the more public assemblies too. But again, just to address the idea that women are to be teaching, again, depending on the context, Titus 2, verses 3 through 5 is another one of those examples where we see explicitly that women are told to teach. In that context, they're told to teach younger women a number of things that Paul lists there. But it's also interesting in 2 Timothy 2 and verse 2, as Paul's writing to Timothy, and he says, what you've heard from me, commit to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. The word men there is the Greek word anthropos, which is mankind or humanity. It's not gender specific. And so there again, you have the idea of, well, the responsibility to teach falls on anybody, regardless of their particular gender. Because I do think some people sometimes will go a little bit too extreme with that. And it is like women have to be totally silent at all times, anytime the scriptures are being discussed. And I just, for one, I don't think, going back to the example of Aquila and Priscilla, I don't think we see that in Scripture.
Right. Yeah.
But there has to be a line based on some of these other passages that we'll be talking about. I guess to maybe dive into some of these things, because I can't remember it exactly off the top of my head which all scriptures were specifically requested. I have them in my notes, but I just don't have them marked. Which ones were requested and which ones weren't. But I guess to get down to kind of the core of the issue is some of the passages that prohibit this particular role or, I guess, method of teaching within the public assembly and the role that women are to play in that. And looking at these passages and then contrasting that with some of the passages that seem to, I guess, argue against that as well. And so we'll do that. There's really only two major passages in the New Testament that deal with it directly, at least. One is in 1 Timothy chapter 2, and the other one is in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. And both of them, I think, have I don't think, they do have different contexts. And I think that's important for us to note as we go through these passages as well. But in 1 Timothy chapter 2, as Paul is writing, and for those of you that attend here at Collinsville, as we've been studying the T epistles of 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, you'll remember that his kind of, I guess, thesis statement or the purpose of the book is found in chapter 3 and verse 15, where he says, "If I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of God, of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth." And so Paul is writing here throughout this whole book to tell Timothy how he needs to conduct himself in the church. And in chapter 2, he begins by saying that prayers are to be offered for all people because that is what is pleasing to God. That's what God wants us to do. And we are to pray for all people, even kings and those that are in authority. And then he uses that to segue into the issue that we're talking about here, because starting in verse 8, he says, "I desire then in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling." Going back to the point I was bringing up earlier about the Greek words, earlier in verse 4, the ESV says, "Who desires all people to be saved?" No, the New King James translates that all men. And there it's the same word anthropos, which just means mankind, which is why it's translated people there in 1 Timothy chapter 2. But then when you get down to verse 8, you see the aner, which is gender specific to the males.
Fellow husbandman, sir.
Yeah. And so there's a shift in that terminology, which depending on your translation can kind of get lost a little bit.
Well, I think
English.
that the ESV and the ASV, that the men, they put that, the word the in front of it.
Yeah.
But also looking at the word that was used, you can tell that difference to your point. So.
Yeah. And so he says that the men should pray everywhere, in every place, lifting holy hands without anger and quarreling. Okay, so he gives us a positive command here. Men are to pray. And then he continues on in verse 9. He says, likewise also that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works. And then this is the rub. This is the problem. This is where all the issues typically come in. Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather she is to remain quiet. And especially 11 and 12 is where people start to have a lot of issues and a lot of objections, and I'm sure we'll look at some of those here in a little bit. But it's interesting to me. I mean, to me, this is pretty clear cut. It doesn't take a whole lot of effort to understand what Paul is saying here. Now, how to apply that in certain circumstances and in certain contexts, okay, granted, that can be a little bit more complicated, but to understand the basic point Paul is saying here, it's not hard. It's not difficult to understand what he's saying, especially at the beginning of verse 12. He says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. You can't really get a whole lot clearer than that. And so you have the positive command in verse 8 that men are to pray, and then I guess you could call it a negative command, but a command in verse 12 and 11 that women are not to teach or to exercise that authority over men, but rather she is to remain quiet. Now, I think quiet is an interesting word because quietly or quiet there in verses 11 and 12, the word that's used there doesn't necessarily mean without a sound. Now, there is a word that means that, and he uses it in 1 Corinthians 14, so we'll talk about that some more when we get there, I'm sure. But the word quietly there basically just means in the proper order. I think it's used in, is it 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 maybe? I'm going the wrong direction. Where we are told that we should learn to live quietly and peaceable.
Possibly because the word is still in stillness, kind of.
No, it's not 1 Thessalonians 2:14.
Hold on. For whatever
is
reason,
it 4?
The eSword version on my laptop doesn't let me click on the occurrences, so hold on.
Maybe it's 1 Thessalonians 4. 4:11. And to aspire to live quietly and to mind your own affairs and to work with your hands as we instructed you. The aspire to live quietly, which is the idea of being peaceable. It obviously doesn't mean without a sound. It just means peaceable in the proper order. And that's the same word, or at least root word, that is used here in verses 11 and 12 for quietly. So there, it does not mean that she is to remain totally quiet, because going back to your point earlier, Ryan, if that were the case, if in the public assembly a woman could not make a sound
yeah.
then that would exclude her from the singing. But we know that that's a command that's given to all people in the assembly. Do you have anything you want to add?
I don't think
Point
so.
out?
No.
Okay.
Well, maybe I do. And not to pull a Robbie or anything, but no. Yeah, actually, I think the thing I key in on there is having authority.
Yeah.
I think when you tie that in with the teaching is where you get the idea of the public teaching, having that authority figure up front.
Yeah.
When someone's, whether it's teaching a seminar or teaching an adult class or teaching from the pulpit as a minister, I think that's you are not necessarily an authority figure, but you are.
Yeah.
You are
leading.
exercise. Yeah, you're leading. That's a good way of putting it. The other thing I would point out is, going back to your point earlier, depending on the audience, I think they could.
Yeah.
Can you have a woman preacher? Well, we do on Ladies' Day, I would argue, and that's because of the audience, right?
Yeah.
So I think, again, you get into this, but remember in verse 8, who else is there?
Yeah, the men.
The men.
Yeah.
So I think that's where we have to... Because he also says not to have that authority over man. In this situation is what we're talking about. We're not talking about necessarily secular world.
Right.
I've had plenty of supervisors that are female.
Yeah.
I'm fine with that, because that's a different setting.
Right.
Paul's not talking about that.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to verse 8, because he's talking about things that are spiritual in nature, that the men should pray.
Well, going
in
back to your earlier point, if chapter 3, he says, "I'm writing you all this so you know how
No,
to
but
act in
in
the
the
household."
church.
Yeah, in the
Yeah.
church, the household
Yeah.
of God. So
Yeah. Now, I do think when you study the home, there's a lot of similarities between the home and the church, obviously, as far as that's concerned. But again, secularly, there's no law, there's no requirements that are set out in that respect. And just to go back to kind of some of the extremes that we were talking about earlier, I've heard of these really, really tiny country churches where it was mostly women, and in fact, entirely women. But then there was a male that was present, but he was not a Christian. And so the question came up as well, should he lead worship because we're women and he's a male? My answer to that would be no, because he's not even in a relationship with God to begin with, which is, I think, kind of goes back to the Aquila and Priscilla example, because Apollos didn't fully understand what he was teaching, didn't fully understand the baptism of Christ. And so Priscilla, they are being able to teach him. And there's been questions raised of like, well, could a woman have a Bible study with a man who's not a Christian? I don't know why that would be sinful in that context. And so we do have to be very careful. Like I said, what Paul is saying here is very easy to understand, but sometimes in the real world applications of it, it can start to get a little tricky. But there is a statement I've heard, first of all, if something's going to bother your conscience, don't do it. Don't do it that way. And there's a statement that I've heard before, there's a way that is right and cannot be wrong. If you ever have any questions or doubts about, if you are a female and you have a male in your life that you want to teach the gospel, but you feel like it would be, or it is against your conscience to sit down and study with him, find a male in your local congregation that would be willing to do it, because then you won't violate your conscience or do anything that you feel is wrong. So we always have to keep that in mind, I think, too. But again, the point Paul is making here is clear. There is to be a complementary role that is played even within the assembly, and males are to take that leadership role. Did you have anything else there with 1 Timothy? I was going to get into the last part of that a little bit later. I was going to go ahead and go to 1 Corinthians 14. Just, again, to look at the passages where Paul lays out some of these prohibitions against women's roles, public leadership roles within the assembly, and then again to look at some of the objections that are made to these things. The other one, as I mentioned, is in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, and it's mainly the last part of the chapter, starting around verse 26, going down through the end of chapter 14 here, because he talks about, I kind of want to read the entire thing just to get all of the context here, but he talks about in verse 33, I'll start there. He says, "For God is not a God of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. The women should keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission, as the law also says. If there is anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Or was it from you that the word of God came, or are you the only ones it has reached?" And so again, he's very clear. There's not a lot of ambiguity about necessarily the general point that he's trying to make. But I think when you zoom out a little bit and look at the context of this, it helps us to better understand. Because as I was talking about in the Timothy passage, the word quiet there doesn't mean without a sound, but the word silent here in verse 34, it does mean without a sound. Well, then you're left with the same question of, well, does that mean that she can't sing in the assembly? Because he says the woman should keep silent in the churches. And again, he even says if she wants to learn something, she needs to ask her husband at home, for it's shameful for a woman to speak in church. And so again, a lot of people look at this as a total prohibition against women speaking in the assembly. And, you know, some people, as a result of this particular passage, some women and families have decided that they're not going to even make comments in a Bible class setting, just because in their minds it would be a violation of what Paul is saying here in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. But I think it's interesting if you zoom out a little bit, women are not the only ones that are told to be totally silent in this context. Because if you were to zoom out a little bit, I'll start in verse 26. I may end up reading this whole thing after all. But he says, "What then, brothers, when you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Let all things be done for building up. If any speak in a tongue, let there be only two or at the most three, and in turn, and let someone interpret. But if there is no one to interpret, let each of them keep silent in church and speak to himself and to God." So there's another group. The word silent there is the same word that he uses there in verse 34 in reference to the women, but these are presumably males that have the ability to speak in tongues. And he says, if they have the ability to speak in tongues, but there's no one there to interpret, they need to keep their mouth shut. They don't need to do anything. And then he moves on to prophets in the next part of this. In verse 29, "Let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others weigh what is said. If a revelation is made to another sitting there, let the first be silent. For you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may learn and be encouraged. And the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets." So you have people who can speak in tongues, males who can speak in tongues. If there's no one to interpret, they are to be quiet, silent, don't say anything. If there are multiple prophets in that assembly, and there's a revelation made to one prophet while another prophet is speaking, the first one is to stop what he's saying so that the other one can speak. And he is addressing, I guess in the background of this, he's addressing a lot of the chaos and confusion that the church at Corinth was dealing with in their assemblies, because that's what he says there in verse 33, God is not the God of confusion, but of peace. So again, I point all that out to say that to go to this verse and say that women being silent in the churches is a total prohibition against speaking, when you look at the context, I don't think really holds up that much, because there's also the same prohibition given to people who can speak in tongues and prophets. You have to determine, well, to what degree and in what sense and in what context does he mean here to keep silent in the churches? Because I think if you make this a total prohibition, I think you run into some issues when you get to verse 35, where he says if she wants to learn anything, to ask her husband at home. Well, that raises the big question of, well, what if she's not married? She just can't ask questions, I guess. She just can't learn, I guess. And to me, as I understand this seems to be more of, and if I remember correctly, in verse 34, I think maybe the King James, maybe the New King James as well, he says that your women should keep silent in the churches, the possessive there. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that what he may be talking about there is not women in general, but the wives of the prophets. And how interrupting and challenging what he was saying, or questioning what he was saying, or asking those questions. And he says, y'all need to stop that because of all of the chaos that they were already dealing with. Y'all need to stop that. And if you have any questions, ask your husband, the prophet, when y'all get home, so as to not interrupt the worship service. What do you have you want to add?
I'm trying to think. There was I don't remember if it was in the. You have it somewhere in here, but the questions and answers by the guy in Woods at the Freed lecture.
Over there.
I don't remember
if Robbie was here, he can grab it.
I don't remember if it was in Volume 1 or Volume 2, but someone asked about this, and he had a really good answer, and I forget what he said, but I think it's very similar to along the lines of, this is, to your point, it's not because I think he's the one that made the point that always stuck with me, that if it was truly you couldn't sing.
Yeah.
And, and then I personally don't think that there's anything wrong with saying amen.
Yeah.
I mean, that just means I'm in agreement. I think
Right.
we get to the point, I think the same thing can be said for man. When you start doing things to draw attention to yourself is where that modesty, which is where we typically don't apply. We talk about modesty in clothing, but modesty can be like any kind of thing you're doing to draw attention to yourself, and interrupting or making to get back to what he started here. God is not the God of confusion. Let everything be done decent and in order, right? There's an order to it. It's not everybody just does what they want. And I think earlier in the chapter, he was trying, they're like, well, my spiritual gift's the best. And, it's like, the spiritual gift wasn't for them anyway. Right. It was for the edification. It was for teaching. And getting back to this is there needed to be some sort of organizational structure. I don't care if I'm teaching class in here, whether a man or a woman stands up and starts to try to debate or try to take over class, that's wrong. Yeah. No matter the gender, in my estimation. Yeah. So I don't know. That's all.
Yeah. Well, and I was just going to add too, keeping silent, yes, but keeping silent in what sense? In the sense that, as you were just pointing out, not trying to overtake the assembly or the discussion, not creating chaos, not trying to bring attention to herself, and not trying to take the lead in the assembly. That's the sense in which she should keep quiet. Because to your point, outside of maybe that last one, that would be true of both males and females. We are to keep silent if we're trying to draw attention to ourselves. Right. Keep silent if we're trying to I guess, be domineering and take over.
Exactly. Back to your point in the verses before that. Why was he telling the men to be quiet? Because they were not doing it in an orderly fashion. They were like, well, I'm first. You know what I mean? It's to your. I think it's gender, not gender specific to what we're talking about. Is there's a way to do it? And it's anyway. I was trying to look at it doesn't say. I was gonna go look at the conversion of Lydia, because typically it says Paul. It doesn't say that in this account, but what I was gonna say is typically it says Paul reasoned with people, and reason to me seems to indicate some sort of discourse or maybe asking a question, and say, well, but it doesn't say that about Lydia. But I don't know.
Well, I would say
now that wasn't in worship service. Obviously, that was in more of a teaching setting. But
I would go to make that point. I would go to Acts chapter 20 and verses 7 and following, the passage that we go to a lot to talk about worship, specifically on the first day of the week, because there, in verse 7, it does say he prolonged his speech until midnight, but it also says that he talked with them, intending to depart the next day. Based on my study and understanding of this, I don't think that this was necessarily a lecture in the way that we do it now. It was most likely a conversation that they had, a back and forth, that maybe obviously Paul would speak for a while, and then maybe he opened it up to them to ask questions. Which that kind of, going back to 1 Corinthians 14, when he's dealing with the prophets, he says, let 2 or 3 prophets speak and let the others weigh what is said. Mm-hmm. Well, to me, that would, again, imply some sort of public discourse of examining what that person said and talking about what they said. And I don't think there'd be anything wrong for us to do that now. I think people would be uncomfortable with it because it's not traditional for me to get up and to speak for a little while and then open it up for comments on a Sunday morning during worship. Yeah, I don't think
I've done not open up for comments, but I've asked questions. Yeah, and we're not necessarily here. I know I've done it at least Godfrey and Indian Creek. I've done it it's okay to answer me. It's not
right. It's not sinful.
So I agree. It's not our norm. I would say, but I've always. thought when it says he goes in the synagogue and Paul reasoned with them for 3 Sabbaths.
Yeah.
That word reason to me, and if I can find it, and I know it's more than once or in more than one place, but I've always it makes me think that Paul would say something, someone would say, well, what about this? And then Paul would reason with them, right? And I think if we don't let people question, are they really learning it? I guess. I don't know.
Well, it reminds me too, which it's not the same word because it was written in Hebrew, but Isaiah 1:18, where God says, "Come now, let us reason together." That word in the Hebrew, I guess it is. It literally means to argue.
Okay.
So it is like that back and forth. And so I would say, I don't know what word is used in the Greek for Paul when he reasoned in the synagogue, but I would think it would be in the same vein. And just based off of the accounts that we have of him speaking with people, that would seem to be what he was doing, is discussing these things with these people instead of giving just a monologue speech and then stepping down and it was done, but more of a discussion type setting, which again I think is what he did there in Acts chapter 20 as well.
Yeah, so like the one in Acts 17:17, the King James actually, excuse me, the King James actually translates it as disputed, and it means to discuss an argument or exhortation, dispute, preach unto, reason with, or speak.
Yeah.
So I think that, I don't know about this one, Acts chapter 18, they actually translate it reasoned, different word. That is to say thoroughly, to discuss an argument or exhortation, dispute, preach. So different word, maybe the same root or something, but I do think that there was a discussion going on. So anyway, so I was trying to tie that back with Lydia in the fact that if I remember right, that whole conversion piece was women at the river, right?
I think so.
So it seemed like it was all women there.
Yeah.
So if Paul would do what he typically did, it doesn't say that, and maybe I'm putting too much
eisegeting.
Maybe I'm imagining too much, but I would think he did it the same way.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know.
Well, I mean, if you're going to convert somebody to Christ, they have to be able to ask questions. They have to be able to talk about those things in order for them to really comprehend what it is that you're saying and understanding.
Make sure they get it.
Well, and like with Philip and the eunuch, which I know that's two men, but they had a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
The eunuch was reading that passage. He was like, "Do you understand what you're reading?" He says, "How can I unless someone explains this?" He asks, is he speaking about himself or somebody else? And so then Philip continued to teach him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think the other thing to keep in mind, and I don't know if you're going to allude to it, is that Paul alluded to a lot of women that were workers.
Yeah.
And I don't know that meant they all taught, but I think there's some of that there.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
definitely.
anyway, so.
Definitely like Phoebe.
Yep.
The deaconess.
Yes. There we go. Another
Which
episode.
just means servant. Make a mountain out of a molehill with that one. Okay, well, I guess because those are the two passages really in the New Testament that deal with the prohibitions that are laid out, and so I was going to go on and look at some of the objections that are made to that, because one of the things that is often said about both of those passages is, well, that was just cultural. Yeah, that was just Paul.
Yeah, or cultural.
It was a patriarchal society where women were deemed lesser than, and
I thought that because I thought it immediately when you read the one from Timothy, because he said, "I do not permit."
Yeah,
a lot of people say, "Well,
Paul was just a misogynist."
Yes, so.
I saw a video of this lady. I don't know what her name is, and I'm glad I don't, because I don't want to give her any more attention than she needs, which is none. But she was talking about how she really she can't stand Paul. And she can't stand reading what he wrote, and she was just talking about how much of a bigot he was, and how misogynistic he was, and all of this other stuff. And I'm like, lady, I don't think you understand what you're saying right now. Because when it comes down to it, Paul answered the cultural argument already. And he did it in 1 Timothy, going back to the passage we were already at. It has nothing to do with his view or his perception. And in fact, which we may talk about this more later. But in fact, when you look at the way the New Testament scriptures talk about women, it would have been countercultural for the first century, which we may talk about that more. But the cultural argument, I think, really falls flat on its face when you go to the end of 1 Timothy chapter 2, because he gives two reasons in verse 13 and 14. He says, "For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor." So two reasons. The first one is rooted in creation, which this, in my mind, is parallel to one of the arguments we made about homosexuality the other week. It goes back to creation. How did God create us? What was the order that he had established in creation? That's what we need to uphold. And that's the very thing that Paul does here first. So there's no culture in this whatsoever. He goes back, well, Adam, the man, the male, was made first, and then Eve. If God wanted women to play that role and men to play the subservient role, he would have made Eve first and then Adam later. But that's not what he did, though many probably wish he had. Adam was created first. And then in verse 14, Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Well, that goes to Genesis chapter 3 with the fall of man. And as he states there, Eve was the one that was deceived. She was the one that spoke with Satan. She was the one that was convinced to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, that's not to say Adam was innocent in that, because we know he was there, as the text tells us in Genesis 3, that Eve gave it to her husband who was with her, and he ate also. But the point is, as he's pointing out, it seems to me the point Paul is making here is Eve was deceived, she was led astray, but Adam just rebelled.
Mm-hmm.
He knew it was wrong. He knew he shouldn't have been doing it. He wasn't deceived. He just did what he knew was wrong. And so because of that, because of Eve being deceived and having been misled, now, in addition to the creative order, to play that more subservient, I don't know, I guess that's the best word I can think of right now, but to serve that role of being submissive, well, as he's talked about in this context, in the public assembly and even within the home, as we see in passages like Ephesians chapter 5. So I think the cultural argument is a fairly weak argument to make, in my opinion. You have anything you want to add to that?
Yes and no. Well, thinking about the same author, when he's talking about in the spiritual realm, Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, there's neither male nor female, no slave or free. It's
Jew or Greek.
When it comes to Christianity, we are all equal, but that does not mean we don't have certain roles.
Yeah.
And I think I heard someone say that, I don't remember where I heard it, but the point was made that you have the Godhead, you have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. They're three independent entities, but they're all three God.
Yeah.
They have different roles.
Yeah.
I don't think while Christ was subservient here, they're still God.
Yeah.
And they're all equal, but yet they have different roles.
Yeah.
Just like, spiritually speaking, we're all equal, but we have different roles.
Yeah.
The same can be said with elders.
Yeah.
They have a different role than a deacon, a different role than what do you want to call, general population of the congregation or whatever. Husband and wife have different roles.
Yeah.
But when it comes to Christianity,
when it comes to value,
you're equal. You're equal, but God has established roles, and we find if it would say, well, I don't want a man to teach or usurp authority over a woman, you and I well, we could probably have this podcast, but it would be maybe a limited. I don't know.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
We would be talking about it differently, but
Right.
we just can't look past the verses that say what they do.
Right. Well, and I think taking Galatians 3, because that was one that I was wanting to bring up too, in that way, I think it really takes it out of context and misses the point of what Paul is saying, because that whole chapter, which this is really the point of the book of Galatians, one of the points of the book of Galatians, is talking about how the law of Moses could not justify. The law was given until faith came, and now that faith is here, we're all justified by faith and not by the works of the law of Moses. And therefore, as many of us has been baptized into Christ, have put on Christ. And so there's no, when it comes to salvation, there's no distinction between Jew and Greek, slave, free, male or female. And to say that what Paul is saying here is that God does not distinguish between these different demographics, or that we should not distinguish between these different demographics, is directly opposed to so many other clear teachings. I mean, even talking about the slaves and the free. Paul talks about that in the book of Ephesians and in Colossians. I mean, you think about the book to Philemon. It's all in recognition of, hey, you're a master. You need to be doing this, treating your servants this way. Hey, you're a servant. You need to be treating your master this way in order to exemplify who Christ is. It didn't do away with those social or gender differences. It just changed how we view them and how we operate within them. And so to take Galatians 3, I think, is just really taking that very out of context, because he's saying when it comes to salvation, there's no distinction. We're all saved in the same way, and it's all through faith in Christ. Anything else you wanted to add to that one?
Nope.
A lot of the other objections, one is in Acts chapter 21 and verse 9, because there we are told, this is talking about Philip the evangelist, if you look at verse 8, and then we're just told very quickly, very briefly, without much explanation really, he had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. And then that raises the question, oh, well, Philip's daughter prophesied, so why can't my wife get up and deliver a sermon to everybody on Sunday morning? Well, again, there's not a lot of information that we have, and that interpretation, again, contradicts the other passages where Paul deals with the roles of men and women within the public assembly. And so that can't really be the intention that Luke had when he recorded that. It just says they prophesied. Now that goes back to our earlier point, I think. Women had a responsibility to teach. Clearly, if they were given the miraculous ability to prophesy, they clearly had a responsibility to teach. But who did they teach? When did they teach it? In what context did they teach? Those are all questions that this verse does not answer. And then when you take into account what the rest of the scriptures say about this particular topic, I would say to interpret that to mean that women can get up and speak at any juncture or any assembly is directly opposed to all of these other things that we have been talking about here. Also, nobody today can prophesy.
There's that.
Nobody can do that today. So even if you wanted to make a special case on the fact that they had the miraculous ability, well, we don't have that today. So that's kind of a moot point, I would say. But either way, I don't even think that's true. I don't agree with that. I would still say, even though they had the miraculous ability, it still had to be done within the confines of what we see revealed later. Do you have anything on that one?
Nope.
Is that a real no this time? It's not a yeah, no.
No comment.
Or a no, yeah. Okay. the other part of that particular point goes to 1 Corinthians 11 in verse 5. A very similar point that's often made. It says, "But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven." Now that gets into a whole other discussion of, of head coverings that's not within the purview of this episode. But I think it's an interesting discussion, and there's some things that Paul says in here that I don't think we'll ever really understand, especially what he says about the angels here. I don't understand what he means by that. But again, if you're taking this to mean that women can prophesy or teach publicly, that's just such a stretch given what Paul says 3 chapters later, and even what he writes to Timothy. But that also raises the question, well, what if she isn't married? Because he's talking specifically about a wife, as it is translated here, which can also mean generally a woman. I believe that it's the same word there. But he says in verse 5, if she prophesies with her head uncovered, dishonors her head, talking about earlier in verses 2 and 3, talking about her husband. And so, again, I think that interpretation raises probably a lot more questions than it really answers. And again, just like with the other one, stands in opposition of the clear teachings that we see in some of these other passages. But people will appeal to all sorts of things like that to say, well, a lot of people appeal to Deborah. She led the people of Israel. She was a judge. Yeah, we talked about that in our Judges episode. First of all, recognizing the distinction between the covenants. There's just so much that has to be taken into consideration when dealing with a lot of these things. And so, as we always say, one of the most important rules in Bible study is always interpret the harder passages with the easier passages. What Paul says in 1 Timothy 2 is easy to understand. That prohibition is easy to understand. So when you come across things where it appears as though women were prophesying and teaching, understand, yes, they had that responsibility, and they still have the responsibility to teach today. But again, as we've been talking about this whole time, in what sense and in what context? Who is the audience? And the passage there in Acts chapter 20 doesn't specifically address that. Even here in 1 Corinthians 11, it doesn't specifically address the audience to whom these women were prophesying. It just says that if they do it, but they do it with their head uncovered, it's dishonorable for her. It doesn't answer any of those questions, which is why we have to look at those other passages to get a better understanding of what he means by that. You have anything you want to add?
I don't think so. I mean, I think we're to the point of where we could continue to give examples of where there are women in the New Testament that taught in certain circumstances, and prophesying was used in the first century, to your point. But also there's no indication that I think you alluded to it, there's no indication that they would have done it outside of the prescribed.
Yeah.
In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, we don't know to your point, we don't know the audience. I don't know. I just think that, to what you said there, the passage in Timothy is pretty clear. I think that to behave in the household of God or the church, this is what the expectation is.
Yeah.
Not that you have to be totally silent, but there is a order of things, and the expectation is you don't try to have that position of authority over the man in a teaching situation.
Yeah, yeah. I would add, too, going back to 1 Corinthians 11, if you look at verse 17, he says, "But in the following instructions I do not commend you, because when you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse." It seems that, at least my understanding is that he transitions here, starting in verse 17, to start talking about their public assembly,
and maybe they
which
weren't.
would indicate that what he was addressing previously
been private.
did not have to do with the public
I
assembly.
was wondering that, but then I didn't actually see verse because I was like, oh, he talks about the Lord's Supper, but yeah, that's a good point because he says the instructions that are going to come.
Yeah,
as
but in the
part of
following instructions, because at the beginning of verse 2, he says, I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I deliver them to you. And then he talks about the head coverings and all of that, and then he transitions in verse 7. But in the following instructions, I don't commend you. So it seems that there might be a distinction there between this is general, not necessarily dealing with the assembly, but in verse 17, he starts specifically dealing with the assembly. The other thing I wanted to hit on, which I alluded to this, is complementary does not mean inferior. Just because, and I know you talked about this earlier too, just because there are different roles and one is a more subservient role does not mean that one is superior to the other. Going back to the example you used of God and the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. The Son was submissive and is still submissive to the Father. But that doesn't make him any less God. It doesn't make him inferior to the Father or the Spirit, and it doesn't make them superior to him. They are all still God. And the same thing is true when it comes to men and women. Yes, we have these different roles. Husbands and men are to be the primary spiritual leaders. Wives is, again, looking in Ephesians chapter 5, are to be submissive to their husbands. But I wanted to point out from Ephesians chapter 5, what I was talking about earlier, how when you read what the New Testament actually says about women, it would have been countercultural, because in verse 25 of Ephesians 5, he says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. In a culture where women were considered second-class citizens, that would have been, I guess you could say, kind of strange to say you should love your wife so much that you would be willing to die for her. That's how much you should value her. In verse 28, in a similar vein there, in the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ does for the church. And so you see, again in verse 33, however, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. So you see, it seems like God and Christ, the Holy Spirit, are trying to correct that mentality that they had, that women were these second-class citizens. And to me, perhaps an even more powerful scripture is 1 Peter 3 and verse 7, because he says, likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel. This is, to me, the key part, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. So he says, you need to honor her and love her, going back to Ephesians, because they are your fellow heirs. Well, what does that mean? It means they're your equals.
Equals, yep.
Even though they play different roles, you are equals in the mind of God. So complementary does not mean inferior. Submissive does not mean inferior either.
Correct.
You have anything else?
No, only to say that I think that it comes down to something you said there. Submissiveness does not mean inferior. It's the person's attitude. You look at the example Christ gave, who was submissive to the point of death. Paul says there in Philippians chapter 2 that he looked to the interest of others rather than himself. Mm-hmm. If someone is humble enough, they will accept what God has given them permission to do, maybe is the way to say it. I don't know. And not be well, I don't think it's fair. Yeah. Well, guess what? I don't think it's fair that I can't be an elder because I'm not married. You know what I mean? That's not my... Yeah. I don't know. That's just where I think it's God said it. That should be the end of it. And I think, but that comes down to what I would say anything we find in the scripture. Am I willing to take it as it is and not be like, well, I know better.
Right.
And I think this is wrong.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily see this any differently than any other doctrinal matter.
It's not.
So,
and it all comes back to what we talked about earlier, culture and people. Well, we don't live in the patriarchal type society anymore, and so we need to reinterpret these passages because it clearly can't mean, or we don't want it to mean, what he says here. And I was listening to something earlier today, just by happenstance. It wasn't really, I wasn't using it in preparation for this, but he brought up the point that with the same line of argumentation that people use to justify women taking on these positions, it's the same logic and the same line of argumentation that people use to justify homosexuality. And he said that he talked about that in a lecture one time at some college. And he said that there were people that did not like that he said it. But if you think about it, I think he's right, because it goes back to what Paul brought up, creation. If you're going to undermine the home and undermine these roles that God has given to men and women, inevitably that's going to lead to homosexual, or not lead to, but it's going to lead to accepting those types of relationships, because it's the same argumentation. Well, that was their culture. That's how they viewed homosexuality back then. But that's not how it is today. And we talked about some of those things in that episode. Was that last week? No, the week before.
A couple weeks ago, I think.
And so we just have to be very careful. And like you said, have the humility to submit to what God says, even if it's not something that we like or something that we agree with, or if we wish it was a different way. That's not within our purview or our prerogative to say how things should be or how we want them to be. We just need to follow God. Anything else?
Nope.
All right. Well, again, thank you for tuning in today. I hope that this has helped, given you some more to think about at least. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Please remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, post it on your socials, text the link to people, whatever, to try to get this out. And as we say, not for our own personal recognition, but just so that we can try to use this to share the gospel and to share the word of God with people. And we need your help in doing that. But I guess for now, we can say this is the
conclusion of the matter.